In this video, we're going to learn how to reference and manage worksheets. There's a distinction between a workbook and a worksheet. When you open up a spreadsheet and you save it, in other words, give it a file name, that file that you have saved is called a workbook. And when you open a workbook, it can contain one or more worksheets, as shown here on the bottom left. The smallest reference point in a workbook is an individual cell. A page full of cells is called a worksheet, and a file full of worksheets is called a workbook. The nice thing about Excel is that you can have multiple worksheets in the same workbook. To add more worksheets, we can simply go to the plus sign here at the bottom left, click that, and it will add a second sheet. I can keep doing that as many times as I want. The nice thing about these multiple sheets is that the cells within them can be referenced across the different worksheets. So for example, on this first sheet, we have a list of employees. If I go to the second sheet and want to reference back to that, I can type in the equals cell and reference this cell B4. And you'll see it brings that value over to this second worksheet. If we click on that cell, you can see here that it refers back to the sheet by giving it this name, sheet 1, with an exclamation point at the end and then the reference of the cell. And that's the notation that Excel uses to reference across worksheets within the same workbook. We can drag that value down, we can drag it across, just like we've learned in the absolute and relative referencing video previously. As we anchor or not, it gives us a different value. So if I reference cell B4 over here and use the F4 key or add dollar signs manually, it will anchor, or in other words, be an absolute reference to that cell. And therefore, as I drag it down or across, it references only that one cell. Another thing that you can do is you can rename the worksheets. Let's say I want to rename sheet 1 as just data. I can double click on it and type in data. That sheet is now renamed, and you'll notice the references to that sheet have updated as well. Speaking of referencing different sheets, if I were to change the name of this to data sheet with a space in it, notice how the reference has now changed to include these single quotes whenever there's a space in the name of the worksheet. I can also rename sheet 2 to be reference. Let's say I want to get rid of a sheet I have too many of. I can right click on it and choose delete. It'll give me a warning message that I definitely want to delete that, and then the sheet is gone. I can also rearrange or move sheets. I can simply click and drag to move it over, or if I hold down the control key, I can actually make a copy of it by clicking control and dragging over to a new location. Another way to do that is by right-clicking on the sheet and choosing move or copy. You'll notice here I have the option to move it before any of these sheets, or I can move it all the way to the end. If I want to create a copy, I can check off this box here to create a copy. I can also move or copy a worksheet to a different workbook. So you'll see I have different workbooks open. That allows me to move or copy data across workbooks. To give you an example of making a copy of this data sheet, I can right-click on it, choose move or copy. I'll choose to move it to the end. I'll check create a copy, and then I'll click OK. This data, you'll notice there are no references to it. It's the exact same data that was in our original data sheet. The sheet, though, has been renamed with a parentheses 2, denoting that it is not, in fact, the original. Now, let's say it turns out I don't need these copies of these sheets. If I hold the control key on my keyboard, I can select both of them at the same time, right-click, and choose delete. Now both of those are gone. Another customization that you can do is change the color of the tabs or worksheets in a workbook. Here you can choose the tab color, and you can denote different things. For example, I may have one color that denotes different data sheets and another color that denotes a dashboard or a summary sheet. The last thing that we'll look at is the ability to hide and unhide sheets. A lot of times you'll have worksheets that exist not to show the user information, but to run calculations in the background or store large amounts of data. Sometimes it makes sense to hide those so that they're not seen by the end user, or so that they don't clutter the workbook while you're trying to work through a different subset of data. So let's suppose that we want to hide sheet 4. I can right-click and choose Hide, and that sheet now no longer shows up on the list across the bottom. To unhide the sheet, I can right-click and choose Unhide, and it will show me a list of all of the hidden sheets, which is just sheet 4 at the moment. So I will double-click that one or select it and press OK, and then it shows me that sheet again. Let's say I want only this sheet that I have referenced formulas on, but I don't want to see the data sheet. Again, I can select both of those, right-click, and choose Hide. This is a nice way to clean up the presentation for an end user. Now, one last thing that I'd like to show you is the fact that you can reference cells not only on different sheets within the same workbook, but on different sheets in a different workbook. So if we press Control-N, gives us a new workbook. And if I type in some data here, and I want to reference that in my original workbook that I was working on, I can click the equal sign and flip over to that new book, select the data that I want to reference, and now you'll notice it gives the name of the workbook in square brackets, the name of the worksheet with an exclamation point, and then the reference. And interestingly, by default, Excel makes any reference in a new workbook or a different workbook an absolute reference by putting those dollar signs in there. You can still remove those dollar signs using F4 or just backspacing them out on your own. But you can reference data in a different workbook. The challenge here is that if you were to share or submit a file that references a different file on your computer, the user will not be able to see what was saved on your computer. They will only be able to see what is in the workbook that you sent them. So when you do those references, please be careful about what it is that you're sharing or sending along. If you were to just send the one workbook, the link would be broken, and when the new person opens that one workbook, it would produce an error for them. So these are some helpful tips on how to manage workbooks and worksheets. As you work with different files, I highly recommend that you spend time labeling each sheet appropriately. It makes it very easy to follow what you or what someone else have already done in that file.